Dungeons & Dragons is fundamentally a game of many things. It's a game of decisions, preparation, anticipation, challenges, teamwork, discussion, exploration, interaction, and like a billion other adjectives. And every single player that comes to the table to play will have a different expectation of what exactly it is that they want to get from the game. What it was specifically that made them want to sit down, throw some math rocks, and play make-believe. This element, the motivation to play, is something that I often think about when I'm considering the design of the game. How does a certain feature, spell, class, subclass, item, whatever it is, appeal to a player's motivation to actually play the game? I think this is something that isn't often discussed overtly, but is absolutely inherent to any good design. At its most basic level, if the thing that you're creating for the game doesn't inspire someone or capture some element of their imagination, it might be worth reconsidering. Now, at the risk of sounding too obvious, there's a reason I chose the word might in that sentence. I'm not suggesting that this is some sort of divine truth. After all, I started this video off by saying that people will have different ideas for what they want to get from the game and the things that they find fun. Some people really enjoy the optimization aspect, others might love roleplay and exploration, while another might really enjoy functioning as a support for the party in combat. However, what all of these things have in common is that they all represent some form of overcoming a challenge or obstacle. Optimizers tend to be combat focused, so they're often looking for the best ways to eke out as much damage as possible. Someone who enjoys RP might really enjoy devising really creative plans or questions, or using open-ended spells like suggestion to their advantage to twist a scenario so it works out just the way that they want it to. The problem though, from a design perspective at least, is when there are elements of the game that circumvent a challenge or core assumption of the game entirely. Things that render what could be an interesting point of conflict or tension in the game not only trivial, but inconsequential and irrelevant. And I'm not talking about one-offs like Pass Wall or something. There are a number of spells right now in 5th edition that do exactly this, and I sincerely hope they get a revision in 1D&D. So let's talk about those spells, the problems they create, and what, if anything, can actually be done about them. The end of the year is getting really close, and I'm hoping to get as close to 5,000 subscribers as possible, so if you enjoy what I do, a sub to the channel would be incredible. Thank you so much. Before we can talk about these problematic spells, I think it's important to explain what I'm not talking about. There's a surprising number of spells that might appear as though they fit this exact description of what I'm discussing here, that being a spell that might be your get out of jail free card every time, but they actually aren't. Spells like Banishment are not problematic in the way that I'm describing. Firstly, the spell has a reasonably high cost of a 4th level slot, it does require concentration, and it often doesn't actually solve the problem you're immediately facing, but rather it buys some time. The point is that it has downsides. It might not work and is only useful in the right context. Even something like non-detection doesn't quite fit despite seeming like it almost would. On the face of it, it sounds pretty great. For 8 hours, you can completely block out divination magic from affecting a given target. If you and your group have a person or artifact with you that needs concealing, this sounds like the easy solution. This is honestly really close to the kinds of problematic spells that I'm talking about, but it's not quite there because as good as it might be, even just some moderate creativity can work around it. If the person trying to spy on the person or artifact knows of an item the target always carries, or knows who they associate with, or where the locations that they tend to stay, it's something that can be easily worked around. Pass Wall, like I mentioned earlier, is another one that gets really close, but is actually a different kind of problematic spell, but that's a topic for a different video. Outside of the Moon Domain Cleric, which is actually a critical role subclass anyway, and the Circle of the Land Mountain Druid, and the Armorer Artificer, this spell only exists on the Wizard's list. So while Pass Wall might be incredibly clutch if you happen to have it prepared exactly when you need it, the majority of the time you're carrying around the spell, it's just dead weight. It's not really doing anything for you, and if it works out that you can use it, well, then you're just rewarded for being well prepared. Appropriate preparation for occasional events is not inherently problematic. So what am I actually getting at then? I'm referring to spells that completely circumvent the very existence of certain challenges or mechanics in the game. One great example of this is a spell that most people probably never even really think of, Create Food and Water. This spell, on the face of it, is pretty innocuous. It probably never even crosses your mind since so few people actually play in campaigns where having access to food and water is relevant to their game. Nearly every game that I've played in or seen just assumes that you have sufficient rations or means of finding food or water, unless the party ends up in some particularly desolate or remote location for extended periods of time where it might then become a concern, but even then it's kinda 50-50. I mentioned in my D&D book tier list video that I'm playing a Tomb of Annihilation campaign, or at least I was until we took a break. I'm not going to go into detail so I don't spoil anything, but as most people probably already know, there is a large portion of the early game devoted to a hex crawl, and I have to assume, depending on how your DM runs it, that access to food and potable water is a particularly relevant element of the campaign. It creates this tension between adventuring but needing to survive. It makes the jungle actually more part of the experience, like a player versus environment element, which is really, really cool. The thing is, once our cleric got access to create food and water, well, that entire aspect of the game was rendered irrelevant, and we were just able to carry on as we would in any other adventure, save for the fact that our cleric would just expend 1/3 level slot every single day. As an aside, the spell creates an offensive amount of food. It makes 45 pounds of food and 30 gallons of water. I'm Canadian, so I don't know what a gallon is, but it's 113 liters. That's this many liters. That is a lot of water. Now, I know that these spells have history, dating all the way back to original D&D back in the 70s. The thing is, that was a very, very different game. It was more like an army and war game in a lot of respects, and doesn't really resemble modern Dungeons & Dragons at all, quite frankly. That's also probably why it provided enough sustenance for an army of 12. Here's the thing though, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I want to start tracking the food and water intake of my players during our sessions. That does sound truly tedious and horrible. Though I'm sure in the right kind of campaign setting, even in Tomb of Annihilation, it can probably be really cool and create different dynamics that force you to think about the game in a different way. The thing is though, spells like create food and water, create water on its own, or even Goodberry, they just completely crush an entire potential aspect of the game into oblivion by virtue of their very existence. Not only that, but it also negates a portion of the 2014 Ranger's Natural Explorer feature, as if that needed any more ways to get hit. Who cares how much you can forage when you can just use magic to make it all happen instantly anyway? It's not all about create food and water and Goodberry. Though I do think these are designed poorly, as they are a no questions asked killer to entire elements of the game, I think they're easily redeemable by just massively reducing the amount of food and water created, and just removing the text from Goodberry that says it provides enough sustenance for an entire day. And I want to be clear that the issue I'm talking about here isn't necessarily any of these specific spells, but rather what they represent. They absolutely should exist and provide assistance to overcome challenges, but they shouldn't just be the answer in themselves every single time without question. Anyway, there's plenty of other spells that fall into this same trap. One that's come under some degree of fire recently is Leomund's Tiny Hut. Now, I won't say it should always be the case, but resting should, at times, also be something of a tense or questionable situation. This is particularly true if you're deep in some cavern or in the depths of a jungle. You shouldn't be able to simply take resting for granted. It was almost by design that they take as long as it does, so it could potentially leave you vulnerable depending on your circumstances. But Leomund's Tiny Hut essentially takes all of that and just throws it out the window. You can basically host a large dinner party in there with up to 9 guests, all of whom can freely pass through the exterior of the dome if they were within it when you cast the spell. Nothing else can pass through it though, not any spells or magical effects, and no one can see inside of it either. But any of the creatures inside can see out, since it's transparent from the inside and opaque, but any color you want it to be on the outside. You could pretty easily cast this and have it blend in with the surroundings reasonably well. Or honestly, even if it doesn't and it does draw the attention of some passersby, you can still safely just complete your long rest before exiting and unleashing everything on the people awaiting you outside. To cap it all off though, the spell is a ritual, so it's not even like you always need to make sure that you have your 3rd level or higher spell slot available to use it. It's effectively free, given that you've got 11 minutes to spare. The spell exhibits the exact same problems as the food and water spells and Goodberry. It takes a core assumption about the game that resting can be dangerous and just makes it not. And yes, I know Magnificent Mansion exists, but that's also a 7th level spell and it isn't a ritual. It's still not great, but it's definitely less egregious. This, however, is a 3rd level spell. It's accessible from quite early on in the game and basically means that your party never needs to worry about long resting ever again. The other thing about Leomund's Tiny Hut is that it isn't susceptible to disintegrate, which many of the other magical barrier-like spells such as Wall of Force and Force Cage are. The thing even has a floor, so burrowing creatures can't make their way through it that way either. The only way to deal with the spell is if a magic user just happens to pass by and has Dispel Magic prepared. Otherwise, you just gotta wait 8 hours. I think the solution here is honestly quite simple. Give the hut an AC and hit points. There's no reason that this thing should not be able to be destroyed. It feels like a hefty oversight. Pass Without Trace is another example of a spell in this category. Honestly, someone yelling, "I cast Pass Without Trace" is probably just as common and memeable as someone yelling, "I have dark vision." Stealth and sneaking around is another foundational aspect of the game that is largely undone by Pass Without Trace. While it might be less egregious than something like Create Food or Water since it doesn't necessarily work every single time, the modifier sitting at +10 is just so high that it might as well let you immediately succeed on any stealth check. Yes, I know you can still fail the check, but there's a reason that this spell is still so commonly picked, and it's because it is just so effective it would be silly not to. If you've got a spell that is essentially always picked because not doing so would be insane, well, that's just a tax at that point, and I'm of the opinion that having a spell or feature tax is not a substitute for good design. There's probably a bunch of ways to reduce the potency of Pass Without Trace. The few that jump to mind would be either reduce the amount of creatures that can be affected by it, or reduce the modifier that it gives to stealth checks and have it potentially increase at higher level casts. There's a lot of spells that fall into this category of undermining core assumptions of the game, but the last group that I want to talk about are the finding and locating spells, including Find Traps actually, but probably not for the reason that you're thinking. Find the Path, another spell probably not thought about very much, is one that immediately sprang to mind for me. Any story arc that requires players to seek out a location is immediately undone by a single 6th level slot. Now, I will say that Find the Path does have the qualifier of the caster needing to be familiar with the location, but that then begs the question of what exactly does that mean? It's pretty ambiguous to say the least. Does someone telling you the details of it now count as familiarity? What about reading about it in a book? Do you have to have been there before? It's unclear to say the least, and that's part of the problem of its design. If you know where it is, you probably don't need the spell, and if you don't, well then how do you qualify as being familiar? Locate Creature and Locate Objects are two other examples of spells of the same pitfall, albeit to a much smaller degree. The restriction of 1,000 feet does certainly help, but it is within 1,000 feet in all directions, so it does go pretty far. If you're trailing the BBG to his lair and come upon it, a quick Locate Creature can give you an absurd amount of information. I want to be clear that I think that these two spells are by far the least egregious of the ones that I've discussed so far, but they still succumb to the same fatal flaw of potentially eliminating a key element of the game through a single use of a spell slot. Find Traps gets a lot of much deserved flack for not doing what its name suggests it does, finding traps, which incidentally has it avoiding the very issues I've been addressing in this video. Funnily enough, I almost feel like it should keep the same effect but change the name to Detect Traps, and that Locate Creature and Locate Object should actually get a similar treatment. Maybe change it to Track Creature and Detect Objects and have the spells detect the presence of the respective thing if it's passed through the area in the last 24 hours or something. This makes it less of a quote-unquote auto-win spell and more of one that allows you to make an informed decision of where to head next, which seems more intriguing to me. Obviously, we know the name change thing won't be happening since Jeremy Crawford has confirmed that all spells from the 2014 Player's Handbook will be present in the 2024 book with the same names. I want to be clear that no, these spells are not the worst thing in the world, and no, they aren't single-handedly tanking the game either, but they are elements of design that simply undermine some of the core pillars of the game, and that just feels inherently flawed to me. Don't get me wrong, I've had each and every one of these spells elicit incredible moments at my table, but that still doesn't mean they interact with the game in a healthy way. I'm curious what you all think about these spells and how they're designed, and if you have any other examples, let me know in the comments below. Subscribe to help me break 5,000 subs, but otherwise, take care.